What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So today in this video, we're talking about the Sony A7C after 1 year of owning and using this camera, and whether or not after a year I still think that this camera holds up, and if you're deciding that you want to buy this thing, whether or not you should pull the trigger and get it. So a year ago I made the switch from the crop sensor Canon M50 over to the full frame Sony A7C. And well, was the switch worth it? You're gonna have to wait and find out. First up, we're gonna talk about the design of the Sony A7C, because after using this thing for a year, I think I have a good grasp of the layout and the design and the ergonomics of holding and using this camera. Full transparency, I got the small rig cage for this camera like a year ago, and I have not taken it off since. That's because the grip on this camera is pretty lacking. You're compromising a good solid feel for the size and compactness of the Sony A7C, because the C in A7C does stand for compact. Now the button placements on this camera are a little weird, I'll give you that. On the back, nothing's really kind of comfortable to push. And it's one of those things where you have to be looking at the back of the screen to know you're pressing one of the buttons. They're so recessed and they're not really that tactile that you don't really know that you're pressing one. There's not like a good firm press. So maybe if you're someone who likes to use the EVF and not look at the back of the camera while you're shooting, if you just want to be able to look through, change your settings, this camera doesn't really help you out with that. Now, while we're talking about EVF, I stand by what I said. This EVF is not great. And there's no substantial eye cup to prevent like flaring on that EVF, so it's just hard to use. Now the Sony A7C also has an articulating touch, and I put touch in air quotes, touch screen. So what the touch function is for is just for touch to focus. You can't navigate the menus with the touchscreen, which is a huge bummer because the menus on this camera are kind of terrible. Now on the side of this camera, you have those nice solid doors for all of your ports. So your SD card has a nice little door to it. Your USB-C, your headphone port, your mic jack, these all have these nice solid doors, and I am a huge fan of those. And you'd think that not having the rubber flaps that stick into the ports would compromise the weather sealing, but it doesn't. This camera still has a weather resistant rating, and I've taken this thing out in rain and snow, light rain, not heavy rain at all, and this camera has just held up against it all. Next up, we're gonna talk about the Sony A7C for photographers, because this is a hybrid camera, so that's equal parts photography and video, and while this thing definitely leans towards the videographer side, it is still a true hybrid camera. It's 24 megapixel photos. It has the same full frame sensor and specs as the Sony A7 III. One of the greatest features of this camera is just the autofocus technology. It is the fastest and stickiest eye and face autofocus that I've ever used. I've been so happy with how easily this thing autofocuses on a person or a subject, and it's made photographing with this camera a breeze. You can focus more on the composition and your lighting and all those things that add the extra little sauce on your photos, when you don't have to futz around with things like autofocus or having to switch into manual focus because your shots aren't sharp. Now I shoot all my photos in RAW, so this doesn't really matter too much, but if you're someone who shoots JPEG, I've been really happy with the colors that come out of this camera. Sony's come a long way on skin color and preserving green tones, and I think it all comes through in this camera. I've used this camera with flashes and inside of studios and outdoors taking professional photos, and it's held up under all those circumstances. I think that this does work as a professional camera. The things that might give you some hesitation for using this in a professional environment would be that it does not have dual SD card slots like the Sony A7 III. So shooting weddings or event work with this camera are a little iffy. I might lean towards the A7 III for that. I have shot weddings with this camera, but I always have a backup camera. Now the A7C does seem like a video focus camera. They added the flip LCD, they added eye tracking autofocus and the tap to focus function where it tracks the subject. Now I really bought this camera to upgrade my video. I was shooting on the Canon M50, which is a good starting point, and it does take really good photos. I was really happy with the photos that camera produced, but the video is where I saw the biggest room for improvement and the biggest weak point of the Canon M50. And I also wanted to get more into color grading my videos. So having a camera that can shoot an S-Log, which is a flat picture profile, allows me to do a commercial shoot for a business and then maybe a music video for an up-and-coming artist and have those have very different looks and feels, because I have the option to color grade and play with the image in post. Now this camera is a fantastic gimbal cam slash action cam. Now disclaimer, when I say action cam, I'm not responsible for what you do with your camera. Use a GoPro. But ever since I got my cinema camera, the Blackmagic, which I'm recording on right now, I've used this thing more as a secondary gimbal action movement type of camera. So while the Blackmagic might be stationary, I can put this thing on a gimbal, move around the space, have that eye autofocus to back me up, and I've really been able to utilize this more as the secondary camera that I feel like this was made for. Another thing I want to mention is if you're a travel videographer, keep in mind this camera was designed for you. And while I just mentioned how much I love using this camera on a gimbal or even rigging it out, this camera is good enough to use by itself without an extra rig or without some accessories or stabilization to it. So the compact size and all the features packed within it make this a fantastic travel photographer or videographer camera. To be honest, the in-body image stabilization of this camera kind of sucks, but I'm gonna give it a little bit of a pass because for the first time in the Sony mirrorless lineup, we finally have gyro data within this camera. So you could toss your footage in a program called Catalyst Browse, and it'll use the gyro data, which tells the camera like where it went within the space. It'll use that information to smooth out your footage, and the results that you're gonna get using the gyro data make up for the lack of in-body image stabilization. Now, if you're someone that wants to use this camera in a professional environment, so maybe you're starting your own business, whether it's a production company, a photography, or just a video business, this thing will work for getting you going, but it's something that you're gonna learn its limitations quickly. For me, I've used the Sony A7C to shoot interviews, both outdoor and indoor. I've used this in commercial photography and studio settings. I've also used it for product photography, and I've used it for product videography. And then I've also used the A7C for wedding films and some engagement photography. So I've used this camera in a wide range of commercial environments. Granted, I want to have a second camera body, so I wanted the A7C to be my secondary camera and the Blackmagic to be my A cam. But for photography, I still use this thing as my primary camera. Now I want to talk about some of the downsides of this camera. So the worst features, I think, for me at least in my workflow, first off, this camera has 8-bit color, which I didn't think would matter at first. I didn't even know what it meant until I started trying to play with the images in post. I shoot in S-Log to be able to preserve as much of the highlights as possible and to get the best dynamic range out of this camera. And I found when I was pushing around the footage, it gets a little wonky towards the extreme. So if you're trying to put a lot of character and style into your videos, then you're gonna run into some problems just having 8-bit color. Another downside to this camera is the speed. When you're shooting high-speed burst photos with this camera, you're gonna run into a buffer quickly. And I've been using fairly fast SD cards, so it doesn't have as much processing or chip power as the Sony A1, which could take high burst photos with a low, very low refresh rate. But for this, you're gonna fill up that buffer and you're gonna have to wait for those photos to write to the SD card before you can pick it up and start burst shooting again. So if you're someone that's trying to get into sports photography, you're probably gonna have to look at a different camera. Another downside, like I mentioned, is just the in-body image stabilization, especially if you're not using a stabilized lens as well, because when they're working together, it's pretty good. But if you're just trying to rely on the IBIS in the camera, it's not gonna be great. Now the last thing, and this is something I only noticed after getting the Blackmagic, the dynamic range on this camera is good. You can get a lot of information in your highlights and in your shadows, but another big part of dynamic range is the way that the highlights and the shadows roll off. So your highlight roll off on this camera, I found is pretty harsh. I'll toss an example on the screen because it's something that's kind of hard to articulate, but the highlight roll off on this camera is a little bit digital. Now some of the best features, like I mentioned earlier, the eye autofocus and the tracking function for focusing is so fantastic. Focusing with this camera is just so easy. You're not gonna realize till you pick it up and hold it in your hand, but you're really gonna start relying on the autofocus and it's gonna be really fun to shoot because of that. Another one of this camera's best features is the image quality. It's such a big improvement coming from a crop sensor, whether it's micro four thirds or a super 35 sensor. Shooting with full frame, you're gonna see that there's just a quality to the photos. You get better, blurrier backgrounds, more bokeh. You get really nice images shooting on full frame, both in photo and video. Another one of the best features on this camera is just that flip out screen. It seems a little like vloggery at first, but then when you start using it, you realize that you can get some good angles using that flip out screen, whether you want to flip it down so you can look down at it, or if you want to get some high angles and flip it this way, it's really going to help you to have a flip out screen so you don't have to bring out like an external monitor on your shoes. Now the big question is, 1 year later, is this camera still worth it? So let's paint a picture. If this camera was like stolen right now or just disappeared and I had the money that I had spent on it, would I go out and buy this camera again? Probably not, and that's just because technology has improved since then. I would look at the Sony A7 IV, to be honest, to be transparent with you guys. However, if I was at the same place that I was a year ago and I was just switching from like a crop sensor camera, I didn't have as big of a budget, I would get this camera again. I think it's such a good starting point to figure out if you want to lean more towards photo or lean more towards video, or you can use this to decide that you want to be right in the middle. I've started my production company with this camera. I've furthered my brand with this camera. I've taken tons of photos I'm really proud of, some prints that I have on my wall taken with this camera. So I think that getting this camera, totally worth it in the long run. If you have any questions about it, feel free to leave them below. I tried to answer within this video any questions I've gotten on previous A7C videos that I've made, but if for some reason I didn't get to like a question you had, definitely toss it below. With that being said, thank you for watching the video. Hit that like button, subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.